So good evening and thanks for joining the webinar. We're just waiting for a minute or so as participants join. Good evening. We're delighted to say that 1,000 people have signed up to this webinar tonight. So I'm just waiting a little bit longer to see how close we get to 1,000 who are actually joining in. There's still a few more people joining, so I'm just hanging on for another half minute or so. Okay, I think numbers are settling now, so let's start. So good evening, welcome from the IET Essex Network. Thanks everybody for joining this presentation on breaking the blockchain. We've been delighted that over 1,000 people have applied to join, which is a record. So it's really handy that the IET has increased its subscription on Zoom. To me, blockchain is something which first emerged around 2008, I think, but it still feels very new. So it's really useful that we've got a presentation on it tonight. The presentation's by Jonathan Roscoe from BT, and he's going to introduce himself at the start. So over to you, Jonathan.
Great, thank you, and hello everyone. Can I just double check that you can see my slides and you're happy with that?
They look good to me, Jonathan.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Jonathan Roscoe. I'm from BT Applied Research based in Martlesham Heath in Ipswich, and I'm a cybersecurity researcher. I've spent a lot of time looking at how we can apply blockchain for enterprise use cases, particularly from the point of view of guaranteeing security. I've also done some work looking at crypto asset analysis for the purposes of cyber defense. And so I'll give you an overview of what blockchain is. I'm going to give a fairly gentle introduction. I'm going to assume sort of no prior knowledge. I won't dig too much into exactly how it works, but hopefully give you enough to understand some of the potential issues. I'll also look briefly at who's using blockchain, what we've been looking at within BT, and then go on to look at how blockchain is potentially vulnerable, because I am a cybersecurity researcher. That's what I'm interested in, is blockchains breaking, with the ultimate aim of making them more secure. So I'll end with sort of what can we do to secure blockchain and make it something that people can trust in, rely on. So start with, what is blockchain? Well, I like to think of it as a sort of evolution of tablet computing. So if we go back 5,000 years ago, with clay tablets, this example from Mesopotamia was being used to record delivery and receipt of goods. I make this joke every time, and it doesn't usually get a laugh, but I like it anyway. Um, uh, Ledgers have their roots as far back as civilization. We want to be able to track information, particularly when it comes to money, and that's what this tablet relates to: the receipt of shipments, or perhaps distribution of rations, and they track tokens potentially that could be used for exchange of goods. That it kind of demonstrates this need to track this sort of information and the benefit, the value that it has to people. Obviously, things have come a long way since 5,000 years ago. We've got much more recent developments, such as 2,000 years ago, where we have things like inscriptions in stone of the life of Roman Emperor Augustus, which provided details of public spending to assist with decision making. And even more advanced with things like papyrus, which was in heavy use at that time, which helps share information across different places, across an entire empire, because information can be transported, it can be shared, it can be compared, divided, prioritized. So that's very important. Even more recently, we've got double entry bookkeeping. So having columns of credit and debit and making sure that we check the errors and that both columns add to zero. This allows for more rational business decisions. It allows you to capture errors, really quite important. And so this is the features I think blockchain or digital ledger technology captures in essence. They allow you to do that error checking. They allow you to record information, and they allow you to share that information with those that need it. I should just mention at this point, so you may hear things like DLT, cryptocurrency, blockchain. So digital ledger technology, or DLT, is the sort of catch-all term. Blockchains, all blockchains are DLT, but not all DLTs are blockchains. And cryptocurrencies are a particular type of blockchain. So that's the idea of what it is and the key features it has. And I think the sort of real roots of what's important with blockchain. But how does it work? And this is a very high level overview. But essentially you have transactions, and these are arbitrary transactions. They may be a transfer of money. They could be some agreement, such as transfer of goods. We have transactions all the time in life and in business, whatever they may be. These transactions are made between participants, so different people with different levels of trust in particular. So blockchain is very effective where we don't necessarily trust who we're working with. And that transaction is broadcast for all to see and verify. So this is a key attribute of transparency and replication of data that gives us security. Security in the knowledge that that transaction we've made is visible to everyone and can be agreed upon and can be checked. And those transactions, once they've been broadcast, they're all locked together in a block. And these blocks are cryptographically sealed and they're broadcast to everyone. So everyone can agree that this is a block that has occurred at this time in this order. And we all agree on what it contains. And each block in turn is linked to the one that came before. And that's very important because it means the more historical data is harder to change, because all of the blocks that have come since depend on it, hang off it through cryptographic algorithms. And essentially what this latest block in this chain does is define the current state of the ledger. So that latest block really tells you, what's happened, where funds are perhaps, or how variables within the ledger have changed. And a sort of simple visualization. So this is a very simplified Bitcoin transaction, for example, and it has these sorts of features. So the first one we talk about is the output, which has an encumbrance, what we call an encumbrance. And that is a requirement in the case of Bitcoin for spending the output. So in this case, a key belonging to Alice is required. That's all that's saying. It also has, the transaction itself has a unique identifier, the transaction hash. And as an input, it also has a cryptographic signature, which satisfies the previous encumbrance, as well as a reference to a previous transaction. And like blocks, transactions happen in chains as well. So for example, when Alice wants to spend money she has been sent, she has to reference the previous transaction and provide her signature that satisfy that encumbrance in order to send money to Wendy, for example. And that creates a new transaction hash that is unique. And that's the basic structure of a transaction in a blockchain such as Bitcoin. And all of these get bundled together in blocks in different ways, which I'll come to in a minute, again, with its own unique identifier and references other transactions. So if any part of any transaction is changed, the entire hash in the block changes and makes it invalid. And as a result, trying to make changes in a ledger like that completely invalidates the rest of the data, which means that other people can detect those errors and they won't accept them. And accepting the state of a block and adding it to a network is done through what we call consensus mechanisms. And it's all about how blockchain users can agree on the current state of the ledger. How transactions and blocks are cemented into the chain depends on these particular mechanisms. And there's one you've probably heard of quite well because it's been in the news a lot, which is proof of work or mining. And this has had a bit of a reputation because it requires a large amount of energy. And the way that works is essentially it's a lottery where you have to guess a random number. And the more you guess, the more lottery tickets you buy, the greater your chance of winning. In this case, though, you're not buying actual lottery tickets. What you're doing is spending computational power to guess these numbers. So people put a lot of resources into powering these mining devices. They're essentially just random number guesses. And because there's value in the reward, there's that chance you can win a certain amount of Bitcoin. Lots of people compete for this, and that pushes up the difficulty, which means more computational power is required to actually have a chance at winning that. And the aim of that is to essentially randomize who can produce blocks and to prevent any one person from having complete control of the network, because so much power is required that no one entity can have more than 51% control in theory. So there's always some variability, and it prevents a centralized system. And that's the particular aim of Bitcoin. But these other methods, so things like proof of authority, for example, they don't require that level of computational expense. So they don't have those environmental costs and certain other risks and issues associated with it. But they do, for example, introduce centralization. But they are very effective in certain applications of blockchain. If, for example, you're looking at developing something within enterprise organizations. And there are various other versions of this. And often we hear about problems with blockchain. I think all the technical problems with blockchain can be solved in various ways, but there are compromises. So the consensus mechanism is important, as it changed some of the attacks you may be vulnerable to. It may change the cost of implementing a blockchain, and it may change things like the environmental impact. But to summarize the benefits of blockchain, I think these are the main ones. You have transparency. It's very easy to verify activity and what's going on the blockchain. Costs can be reduced through better compliancy and efficiency. There's also very high data integrity. There's a lot of replication, there's auditability, there's verifiability. Collaboration, there's a high degree of connectivity between participants. I think the best blockchains are essentially between people who don't trust each other. And blockchain enables trustless cooperation. And there's also very high security. There's a number of mechanisms that blockchain is built on and concepts that make it inherently secure. Now, I've been talking about blockchains in a general sense, but I want to outline cryptocurrencies and contrast them to other blockchains that you may see discussed. So cryptocurrencies are massive. They've got a market cap approaching £1 trillion today, and there are hundreds, thousands of them. The most popular one is Bitcoin, and it remains the most popular. There are others you may have heard of, such as Ethereum, Tether, Ripple, which try and do different things. So, for example, Ethereum has introduced the concept of smart contracts, and is looking to automate many things, introduce business logic, and provide a new way of carrying out automated transactions, whereas Bitcoin is attempting to replace traditional currency. And there are many variations, and these go up and down, and particularly in the cryptocurrency markets, we see a lot of speculative investment, as well as scams and attacks on them as well. So there's a lot of money there and also a lot of risk. It's interesting, we can watch and monitor the exchange of funds being sent between Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other popular cryptocurrencies. And that's very interesting from a cybersecurity perspective, as it indicates potential money laundering. It's very interesting for traders, as it indicates which cryptocurrencies may be about to take off, or maybe sort of dying out, or may just be more effective and more preferred amongst users. But the very first cryptocurrency is Bitcoin, and it's the one that started blockchain. And you've probably heard of this. No one knows who created it. There's a few people who claim to have created it. There's a few people others think created it, but it's unclear. And there's no single development team either. So over the years, many people have contributed to Bitcoin in its various forms, and it's fully decentralized. There's no one at this point. There's no single person behind it. And the aim is to overcome perceived problems with traditional financial models. And one of the indicators of that is this message that was hidden in the very first block. And it's a quote from, it's the Times headline from the 3rd of January 2009 about the Chancellor being on the brink of second bailout for banks. So it's the first, and it's a form of digital currency, and it's the most significant cryptocurrency and remains the biggest. But there are others that are quite popular. The second most popular is probably Ethereum. The other thing you've probably heard a lot of recently is NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. And fungibility is about two goods of the same type being equal. So if you lend someone a £10 note, for example, you don't necessarily expect that exact £10 note back. You will accept any £10 note because they're all equal. But on the other hand, many things are non-fungible. An example of that could be canvases. So you can have two very different canvases with very different values. And that's what NFTs are. They're about providing a way to digitize and transfer assets that represent some unique piece of information. So there's cryptocurrencies and what we call the public blockchains. The other big category of blockchains is enterprise or private blockchains. Now, public blockchains aim to be decentralized. In general, there's no sort of authority that exists to control what happens with the currency, to change the way it operates. That has to come about through sort of community consensus. Whereas enterprise, private blockchains, well, firstly, they're private. Access is very much controlled. Often they're faster because of the way they work. You can make compromises in the consensus mechanism. So you essentially, you no longer have sort of equal access. You can have greater governance, and you can have a central authority. So one of the issues with Bitcoin is that if someone commits fraud or theft, there's no way to recoup that without the cooperation of whoever's committed that fraud or theft. So that's one of the big challenges. And it's great for managing, private blockchains are great for managing relationships between organizations. And I've talked before about the benefits that you've got increased communication. You can do things like carry out financial transactions bundled in with your business transactions rather than having to separate activities such as service agreements from financial transfers. And it's been looked at things like supply chains and also general auditing goods, and I'll discuss some of those in a bit. One of the reasons that I'm most interested in blockchain and cryptocurrencies in particular is things like this. This is an increasingly common sight. Entire organizations have been shut down overnight as a result of ransomware. So this is malicious software that infects your computer and then encrypts rather than steals your data, and demands some payment in order to decrypt your data so you can access it and get back to work. Now, often cryptocurrencies are used to demand this payment, because as there's no central authority, they can't be shut down. Bitcoin is probably the most common one to use as well. There are other cryptocurrencies specialized in anonymity, but one of the reasons Bitcoin is so popular is because it is a lot more accessible for the victims. So someone who doesn't know much about using computers, so doesn't know what cryptocurrency is, they can very easily download an app, put in their credit card, and send some Bitcoin. Other places we've seen it is in scams such as this. So there was quite a high profile attack on Twitter last year where a flaw, I think, in their second factor authentication allowed people to log in as high profile verified accounts, Uber, Apple, Barack Obama, Elon Musk, and send this very common and sort of basic scam, which is seen in the cryptocurrency world, where send me some cryptocurrency and I will double it. And obviously, because of who was saying this stuff, I think quite a few people fell for this, and it's quite a common scam. The other one is that cryptocurrencies are standard on darknet markets, where we see the sale of confidential information and intellectual property. So it's very interesting if you're carrying out investigations into leaks or identifying where software and data has come from and gone to. So in terms of who's using blockchain, I think we've all seen the hype. Something I personally try and avoid. I see a lot of X, Y, and Z on the blockchain. I try to, although I'm very passionate about blockchain, I try to look at it rationally and look at how we can actually get real benefit from it. And there's we've seen a few things such as companies adding blockchain to their name and seeing their shares go up massively. We've seen claims that the answer to everything and that it's going to disrupt this, that, and the other. I think the realizations will be a lot more mundane, and we need to get beyond that hype to a point where people can actually utilize blockchain without just, I think many organizations often sort of dismiss it because they don't understand how it can be helpful and they just see it as something, a fad that's going to come and go. If you look at work by McKinsey, they've published this review of market opportunities. So some of the ones that benefit the most are property, finance, public sector, and agriculture. And in terms of sort of feasibility impact, really we're looking at finance, telecoms, and public sector as the standout ones. In terms of the companies involved, well, there's a lot of them. So, for example, BP are looking at doing oil trading. Companies like IBM are involved with the development of platforms for blockchain, as well as JP Morgan, Facebook. You've got Amazon and Google offering cloud services for blockchain. Others like Nestle and Unilever are looking at preventing issues with food distribution. Cross-border payments is another common one that's being looked at by companies like Deloitte. For BAE, they're looking at things like banking and digital identity. GE Aviation looking at parts supply and auditing parts for planes. And there's a lot out there, and a lot of people doing it for very different things. I think that just shows the sort of real potential of how it can be used in different ways. In terms of what we're doing at BT, our major ones, so I've spent a lot of time looking at forensic analysis. So this is providing information to cyber investigations teams who are dealing with cryptocurrency transactions relating to, for example, the sale of malware or theft of data. Monitoring understanding builds on that. So we're actually interested in understanding how a blockchain is performing, particularly in the case of an enterprise network. Blockchains aren't simple black boxes, they're complex ecosystems. They change as different participants engage with them. And so in order to make sure they're stable and remain stable, it's important that we continue monitoring their behavior and performance and understanding what impacts them. And I'll come to that in a bit more detail soon. We've also looked at number management. This is part of a collaboration we did with Ofcom as well as other members of the UK telco industry, where essentially we want to provide a central numbering database that will reduce costs, reduce failures, massively speed things up. So, for example, porting a number as the primary use case, where at the minute that's often a very manual process. There's a lot of telcos, particularly small ones out there, who often struggle to identify when a number is being transferred, who they need to go to make sure that's routed properly. So having a central numbering database could help improve that and facilitate how quickly that's done. We've also looked at things like endorsed identity. So that's helping to build an ecosystem where often, for example, if you want to open a bank, you'll be asked for 2 forms of ID and proof of address. And often people take as proof of address a recent bill. But really those bills don't prove anything. They're not an official document. It's just a piece of paper that anyone could have printed off. So we really want to bring that into the 21st century and provide something more secure that brings those customers into the loop. So the idea is that if an organization has a long-standing relationship with a customer and that customer wants to go into a different organization, such as a bank, we can use blockchain as a way of sharing information with the customer's consent to verify who they are, what their address details are, and use this as a way to prevent identity theft and fraud. We've also looked at vehicle security. So as we have higher levels of automation, we're expecting more and more data to come through vehicles. And that data will be of interest to different parties. It will be of interest to local traffic control, be interest to the police, be interest to news services. It will be of interest to insurers, national management, and so on. So we've looked at blockchain as a way of sharing information, also in a way that can be sort of witnessed and verified by vehicles that are near each other. Some of the others that we've considered but haven't really explored and done any proof of concepts with include things like device compliance. So this is particularly for networks, home networks, for example, or small business networks, where devices are being onboarded onto a network all the time and they're being bought from various sites rather than sort of well-known brands, and they may have various flaws in them. So we want to use blockchain as a way of monitoring their behavior, engaging with them, and ensuring that they perform as they should. We also looked at things like asset management. So in particular for supply chain, where we have a number of parties, such as an upstream manufacturer, internal sales teams, and end customers. And the idea is to make that journey a lot smoother, improve tracking, automatically respond to faults as they occur as part of the process of building in the logic of how you deal with an issue, how you detect an issue, so that customers can be saved that time and energy. We've also looked into facilitating shipping and logistics by providing e-borders for document control and management. We've also looked at microservices. So particularly with IoT and edge devices, where there may be a limit in power, but they want to make use of some local services, perhaps to carry out AI and reduce load on the IoT devices. So we've looked at how they might be managed. And we've also looked at securing AI. So how can we use blockchain to provide verification of actions? How can we coordinate multi-agent systems? And how can we distribute computation and data sharing? And I think I'm proud to say that BT is a leader in blockchain innovation. So we're the second most active European patentee, and we've been given numerous awards for the technology we've developed. Examples of some of the patents, so things like profiling and threat detection, so identifying threats to blockchain systems, using blockchain for managing IoT devices, something we call immunological memory, so based on a biological concept of information sharing within the immune system, using that for protecting networks by using blockchain as a vehicle for that. Access control, so having sort of reputation-based access to systems through a blockchain implementation. Evolutionary learning, so enabling different systems who are exposed to different threats and harms to share what they've learned. Secret verification, so one of the big issues with blockchain, and I'll explore that in more detail soon, is the fact that everything is shared, which often means that data is exposed. Now, if you're dealing with personal confidential information, you don't want that. So we've looked at how we can share secrets or verify secrets between two parties, where the sort of third party verifiers don't have to actually know that data. And we've also looked at homeostasis and improved connectivity to allow people to utilize blockchains more. And it's a very active research area of research for us. And really, we're sort of developing new techniques to empower existing products with blockchain technology, make it more secure and more versatile for the challenges faced by industry adoption. So I'll talk now about what I'm passionate about, which is the vulnerabilities of blockchain. And that's why I titled my talk, Breaking the Blockchain. Blockchain's alluring for many reasons, but we often see, and it's always a big deal in the news when we see about theft and about issues with blockchain and some of the sort of challenges. I think blockchain is a very secure technology, but there are different types of attacks, and we need to understand those. And the different types of attacks can be broken down into these 5 categories. So the first one is networks. And the network attacks, these are about how nodes, how peers in the network, so these are different organizations sharing information on the ledger, how they're connected and how they maintain and update the ledger. There's transaction attacks. So these are attacks on the way that transactions are perceived and executed. There's smart contracts. So smart contracts are a particular type of transaction or sequence of transactions, and they may have vulnerabilities because they implement programming logic, or there may be other errors in the implementation. There's mining and consensus attacks, so attacks against those who make decisions on how blocks are created. And there's wallet attacks, so the way an individual uses the blockchain or software to access the network. I think that last one is probably the biggest and most common one, is particularly when we hear about theft of cryptocurrencies. A lot of it comes down to social issues or sort of poor security hygiene, where people have either been phished or their passwords, their keys were stored on a server unencrypted. And here's an overview of the sort of different attack categories that exist and the sheer number of attacks in there. And there's quite a good couple of papers that you can explore to learn more about these in detail. But for example, I think one of the first ones, a frame-up attack, that's an attack whereby incriminating data can be placed into the hands of a recipient through the nature of blockchain technology. So I've talked about how everything is replicated. An example of this is in Bitcoin. It's known that there are pornographic images within the chain. So these pornographic images, that data, are downloaded to all participants in the ledger. Then there's routing attacks from the next category, where we're talking about fragmenting the network. Also not from the next category, from the network category, where we're talking about fragmenting the network so that inconsistencies emerge. And this can be due to latency, it can be due to routing issues, and essentially giving different participants a different version of the ledger by limiting their access to the network. And that's similar to a double spend attack, where there's a step of fragmentation in order to make it appear as if a transaction has occurred. So for example, that you have received some money, when in reality those funds have been sent elsewhere. But if, for example, you have a poor connection and you're not properly monitoring the blockchain network, you can be given a distorted view of reality. Then there's things like privacy exposure under the transaction category. I'll come to that in more detail in a moment. Smart contracts, so they're vulnerable in the same way as traditional code. Users may inadvertently use maliciously generated or poorly written contracts. And we've seen examples of that where the same parent cryptographic key was repeatedly used, and that led to a very large number of compromised accounts. And the other thing is, whoever creates blocks essentially defines the state of the ledger. So it's open to abuse. So for example, with mining, miners may refuse to include certain transactions in their blocks. And that can lead to delays or an inability to transact for some people. So a couple of examples. This is a visualization in a BT tool called Nexus, which does graph-based visualization. And what you can see here is the Bitcoin blockchain. And a couple of years ago, there was a major fork of the chain where two groups disagreed on how it should be implemented. And what happens when that occurs is the groups go their own way and they do their own thing, and their history diverges. So they went their own way, but transactions remain partially compatible. As a result, transactions can be executed twice, which essentially meant people were making payments twice. Now, it didn't change where the funds went, but it did mean that some people, for example, were receiving double the funds, and causes lots of confusion and behavior. And this has come about as a result of a social agreement where people have decided that they will part ways and do different things. In this case, both retain some value, so having your funds duplicated was not desirable. Another example is this. So what we're looking at here is essentially what happens when your smart contract goes viral. It's a type of unintentional denial of service. So it's graph visualizations of Ethereum. On the left, you have a fairly normal day of activity, and there's a large cluster of token operations, which we see all the time. On the right, though, there's a graph from the first few hours of the CryptoKitties launch. CryptoKitties is essentially a trading card game. And what you can see is a very large amount of trading and other related activity. And this sudden burst in activity, the sudden popularity of this particular contract led to problems for other users of the network. And the reason why I'm using these visualizations is because they're potentially very useful in understanding activity on the blockchain. So we can potentially identify and automatically recognize different types of activity so that remedial action can be taken. And you can see in these two visualizations, even if you don't fully understand them, they are very different. And there's very different types of behavior going on here. So it means that we could potentially more carefully manage resources for blockchains by understanding these sorts of problems. Another example is the DAO, so the Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And this is a concept built on Ethereum. It was a form of venture capital fund that used complex smart contracts to make investments. It was really popular, raised about 50 million US dollars. Unfortunately, it was discovered that the contract had flaws in it that allowed funds to be siphoned off. And that led to a massive loss of funds for investors. Now, what was interesting about this was that due to the scale of the loss, the majority of people agreed. And this is an interesting example because although I've said that blockchains are secure, they can't be rewritten without interference, if the majority agree, anything can happen. And due to the scale of the loss, it was actually decided to undo the damage and fork the Ethereum blockchain. And the majority of people went with that fork. So they essentially undid that history. Then there's the one that I've done a lot of work on, which is breaking blockchain privacy and understanding the risks of using blockchain and some of its features. And we've seen this in Bitcoin quite a bit over the years. The most common way was published about 8 years ago, and it's through the analysis of transaction graphs. And this is the general technique that I've been following. And it's essentially done by looking at the network of participants and try and understand where transactions originate from. It can be very difficult to de-anonymize traffic. So the one on the right, for example, attempts to understand who's actually participating and where transactions are being broadcast from, and sort of use geo-IP to identify people. That can be a challenge. And often there is, although everything is visible on the Bitcoin network, it's still pseudonymous. So you can't necessarily tell who that is in the real world. Now, I showed you those previous visualizations. I just wanted to show you them again, but this time underneath them, I've put this graph visualization. So this is a bipartite graph visualization. That is, there's two types of nodes. One is an account or a user, an individual. The other is the transaction hash. So in this case, we can see Bob is sending funds via this transaction to Alice. And it can get more complex. You can have Bob sending funds to both Alice and Wendy, for example. Now, once we've done that, we can visualize that. So I showed you this tool before, but here's another example. Here, what you can see is 3 Bitcoin addresses. And these three addresses, the large red pentagons, are associated with the WannaCry malware. So this was the ransomware that affected the NHS quite severely in 2017. And we were able to monitor the Bitcoin network because it is a public network and everything is visible and transparent to everyone. We were able to identify funds coming in, the amount of funds, time, and also and plot that. Now we can also look at where these funds have come from, where they go to. And that's where it gets really interesting, because you can start to see structures, you can start to see patterns, you can start to identify things. So I know, for example, that this structure here is an exchange. I know, for example, this is a donation pot. And what's interesting when we explored the graph is we identified other similar structures. So this orange one here is actually associated with NotPetya, a completely different piece of ransomware. And it is a very similar structure to the three that we're interested in, WannaCry, and a very different structure from things like the exchange. And that's interesting because it means we can start to identify activity and potentially identify and de-anonymize users on the blockchain. And here's another closer visualization of that. So what I became interested in is utilizing open source intelligence. So open source intelligence are documents found on public internet sources. It may be network information, compromised accounts, and so on. Often with cryptocurrencies, what we're talking about is people who have published their addresses online, which is very common when you're looking at vendors, for example, on the dark net or even ClearNet. They will share their addresses on forums, they'll ask for funds and so on. And so what we were able to do is identify some addresses that were associated with the transactions. So here's a different visualization. On the left-hand side, you have the three WannaCry addresses again, and I'm only showing the outbound transactions. And you can see there's a sort of an attempt at money laundering. So the funds are separated and they're rejoined later on. That's to try and hide where they've come from, where they've gone to. These three orange nodes, we identified through open source intelligence that these actually belonged to an exchange. So we knew that at this point, the funds had effectively changed hands and there was no way to know who they'd gone to. And probably the people after this point had nothing to do with the ransomware attack. And that was our sort of first foray into this sort of analysis. Our conclusion was that graph motifs, so the patterns that occur, are potentially a very powerful way of understanding the data, understanding the relationships, classifying events, summarizing activity, and potentially identifying different entities on the blockchain. To give you an example of some of these motifs, so consolidation, this is where someone is, for example, scraping together change from their sofa to make a large purchase. So a bunch of £1 coins making £5, for example. Then there's things like donations. That's a large number of unconnected people making very small contributions over a long period of time to a single person. Then there's distribution. That's one person, I should say user rather. It could be an organization or multiple people, but one person making a single payment that goes out to many others. There's concepts like linked ownership. So this is a higher level analysis where accounts have their own patterns of activity, their own behaviors, but occasionally they seem to join together to make, for example, a large purchase, move funds onto a third party and so on. And then there's obfuscation. So this is that behavior of sending funds back and forth, splitting it up to different places, but eventually they want to bring it back together so they can consolidate those funds. And that's what that looks like. So what we looked at was encoding this sort of activity. And what we wanted to do, because there's so many different possible combinations, we wanted to represent this information in a sort of finite number of possible values. So what we decided to do was actually compare each node in the graph, each address, with all of its neighbors, so that we could see, does this stand out? Is there a certain pattern of activity? So for example, there's a concept called cold wallets, essentially used by exchanges, marketplaces, businesses, organizations who have a large number of funds, and they will transfer funds to that cold wallet and it won't really be used for anything else. And that means there's a particular pattern that surrounds that, because they'll have lots of what's called triangles, which is where you have nodes that are linked in multiple pairs. So 3 nodes that will be linked to each other, and other things. So we can look at the relative value of them. We can look at size, we can look at the frequency, even things like the date and time that they were sent. We can look at the ratio in and out transactions. Exchanges, for example, will often receive lots of small funds, consolidate it. So they have a very different receive sent ratio. And what we were able to do was essentially have a finite number of classifications for different addresses, so that we could automatically identify things like exchanges or marketplaces or lone individuals or people who were, for example, selling software. And we've been kindly awarded 3 different awards for this by the IET, by TICE, and by the peer awards for our work on classifying these Bitcoin transactions. And one of the reasons why I've mentioned previously is the sale of sensitive data and intellectual property on the dark web, where cryptocurrencies are standard. And I'll show you this case, and I will just say that these are anonymized, these aren't real hashes. But essentially, we had this case where we were looking at an address we'd identified. It was listed on the website of someone selling software to attack US financial institutions. And what you can see is this pattern where there's a payment in this case, the first one is a very large payment, and then immediately that payment, those funds are sent out to a different address. So that's someone making a payment to this person, and this person is consolidating them elsewhere. And we actually see that occurring every time funds received, they're quickly moved out again. And this first transaction is actually the initial purchase of a piece of software. The size of the arrow is the value of the funds, and these smaller ones, they're actually part of a service contract. So the guy apparently had very good customer service, and would update software to attack new targets or to fix bugs as they occurred as targets changed their sites and so on. And we noticed that he seemed to send, although he mostly sent the funds to different addresses, there were a couple of occasions where he sent them to very closely linked addresses. So you can see these triangles here. So we thought we'd explore more. And as I mentioned, the nature of Bitcoin is that we can download and access all the data there. But that graph grows rapidly, and it's very difficult to visually assess. And I think this is really pretty, but it's also pretty useless. There's far too much data there. We're talking tens of thousands of edges, thousands of nodes. It's really complex, even if you know what you're looking for. So that's where that feature descriptor I described before, where we were comparing each node to its neighbors and coming out with a finite category for it, comes in useful. What we did was applied that classifier, and we were able to identify 5 nodes within proximity of the node of interest, massively filter it down to the categories that we thought were relevant, and very quickly identify 5 addresses here, the orange ones, that had very high degrees of similarity. Now, when we gave these to our threat intel team, they were able to, from 3 of these 5 addresses, identify other ClearNet and Darknet websites where these occurred. And these other websites provided new intel. One, for example, linked to his Facebook, one linked to his LinkedIn profile. So we were able to work with law enforcement to provide information towards that investigation. And so we've had a lot of success in that sort of analysis and using it for protecting organizations and supporting sort of the anti-money laundering and know your customer checks. But in terms of enterprise applications, one of the things is what can we do to secure blockchain? And that includes the sort of privacy issues, which obviously we're utilizing for cyber defense in one space, but if we want to use blockchain for legitimate reasons, we still want to maintain privacy. So I'm very interested in modifications to blockchain. So I'll go over some of our sort of recent patent filings. The first one is blockchain homeostasis. So we've developed a mechanism that automatically adjusts network configurations. For example, if the number of participants changes, that can lead to vulnerabilities in the consensus mechanism. So we've looked at how we can automatically adjust the behavior of the network, deploy new components, and ensure they remain stable and secure. And this is something I think is particularly important for the enterprise application of blockchain, where we want to ensure, because often we're working with people we don't trust, we want to ensure that remains secure and reliable. We've also looked at sort of dynamic chain connector, so implementing a way to utilize blockchain for an application without having to worry about what your blockchain is. There are different blockchains for different use cases. For example, an IoT device using blockchain to store sensor readings is very different from a blockchain being used to carry out financial transactions. So we're looking at a blockchain connector that allows you to specify your requirements, your security requirements, your performance requirements, your feature requirements, and allow you to dynamically swap between different blockchains and make use of them based on what's available. Another one is secret verification. So I mentioned before, privacy is a concern. And often what you want to do is share information or confirm that two parties have information. A good example of this within the telco space is pack numbers. So a pack number is used when you want to move from one provider to another. And this is usually a number that's generated by the company you're leaving, and you provide to the company you're going to, and then behind the scenes, they will talk to the company you're leaving just to check that it's really you. But that could be replaced by something else. So for example, it could be a piece of information you know that also both those parties know. And an example of that is an address. So if your billing address, for example, is known by both parties, which it should be, those two parties can compare what they've got and check, oh yeah, this is the same address. Now, doing that on blockchain is difficult because if you put data on a blockchain, everyone can see it. So what we've been looking at is using a form of hash and a form of probabilistic storage unit in order to share that data and provide a level of certainty. It's not absolutely certain that it's the same data, but it's mathematically probable that it's the same information. And doing it this way means that everyone can verify that this process has taken place, but they can't see the raw data that was involved. So you're not sharing your personal information with everyone. Another thing we've been looking at is abstract syntax trees for analyzing smart contracts. So this is a visualization of an abstract syntax tree. Essentially what we've done is convert the code into a graphical representation. And like I mentioned those motifs before in looking at transactions, here we can do the same thing, but with code. We can detect potentially malicious code if we've seen it before. We can detect erroneous fragments or strange behaviors and features of code that perhaps we don't expect or know are bad. And what we've been doing is wrapping all these features up into a sort of universal tool that we're calling Nova. And it's a blockchain analytics dashboard that we've packs all this together. It's generic, it connects to different blockchains, and it provides security and monitoring insight, as well as the ability to carry out transactions and to develop new blockchains. And it supports things like querying, searching the blockchain, just like any other blockchain tool. It's like an explorer. It supports forensic analysis, it supports vulnerability analysis, monitoring of the underlying network as well, and that ability to work with different blockchains. And we see this as something that's potentially missing from the current toolkit. There's a lot of blockchains out there in different implementations, but actually using them, accessing them is very challenging. And just to sort of give sort of three main use cases with targeting. So firstly is sort of forensic investigation for know your customer and anti-money laundering purposes to support law enforcement, government, financial services who may be interested in using blockchain. Also blockchain management. So for organizations that want to use blockchain but need to monitor and understand the risks, providing insight and confidence into the blockchain technology they're using, so particularly DevOps and administrators. And then also developers, so those writing code that's running on blockchains. So doing things like that abstract syntax tree analysis, that smart contract vulnerability analysis, and also understanding the state of the environment that they're working with. No doubt there are other use cases as well, so if you've got any ideas for that, I'd be interested in hearing. And I'll summarize just here and open for questions. I think blockchain is a very prominent part of the cybersecurity landscape. but there's also a lot of opportunity for us to do things with blockchain. And if we want to encourage uptake of blockchain, we need to think beyond the applications and how it fits into a traditional ecosystem and the tools that are required. And I think that's really what's going to be the enabler, is giving people the confidence to feel secure in the technology. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time. And if you've got any questions, please.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Jonathan. I must say I'm slightly embarrassed because I started off saying blockchain started around 2008.
You weren't off by long.
You opened saying I was about 5,000 years out. So.
Just a few months. Oh yeah.
Famous error. But after that, no, you've given us a wonderful coverage of the what, the who, the applications, and then moving on to all sorts of security areas and realizing just how broad it is. Now, we've got several questions which have already been asked. I'll read through them. One or two, I think, have been answered because they were asked before you got to that point, Jonathan. And several people are asking about recordings. So I'll say this is being recorded, and the IET will send round emails with a link to the recording for the people who are present. So first question. This is from Phil Rudd. How concerned should we be about the advent of quantum computing and the potential ability to either change the whole block history or obtain the 50% dominance? Assuming this is possible, how easy would it be to upgrade Bitcoin network to become more resilient?
So I know the NIST are doing a review of quantum safe algorithms. I'm afraid I haven't looked at it in the last couple of months. I don't know if it's been published yet. But I think the main thing is being aware of it. I think this is going to be true of sort of many areas of cryptography. There are quantum safe algorithms out there. We don't know what the best ones are. I think many of the ones used in blockchain already are quantum safe. So it's a matter of adapting those when there's a standard for that. So I'm not sure if there is a proper standard for quantum safe crypto algorithms at the minute. I think if there is that possibility, I don't think it is with the sort of the major blockchains. I think they are quantum secure at the minute, but I think that potential for someone to gain 50% dominance is a genuine concern. As I said, it's never happened on Bitcoin because that is the largest blockchain, but it has happened on smaller cryptocurrencies that use the same method, purely because they just don't have the numbers to prevent dominance. So it is definitely something that can happen. But I think being aware of that and understanding what type of consensus mechanism to use and which algorithms to use is the main factor. So it is a solvable problem.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. We've got one or two questions touching on climate change and obviously the concern over the energy used in the proof algorithms. I know you've touched on it already, Jonathan, but can you give a general sort of assurance to people about what's likely to come?
Yeah, I think there's a few factors to this. I think it's more complicated than it being a waste. Everything has an environmental impact. If it's not a waste of energy. It serves a purpose. I'm not going to argue whether or not it's right, but there is a purpose to it, and that is to secure your transactions. So it's not a completely sort of reckless, pointless waste. But I think there's a challenge in that proof of work only really works if you're the biggest. So I think others other than Bitcoin will struggle to do that. So where we're talking about enterprise applications is generally not a concern. I think there's been some stimulation of sort of green and eco-friendly mining establishments, which I think is a good thing. But yeah, I think the main thing is that it serves a purpose. The reason why it's so power hungry is to do work that others can't replicate, and it has a cost. And it's the nature of computing that there's an environmental impact. But I think it'd be similar to, you could go for something easy that had no environmental cost, but it's like trying to say, why have you built a bank vault, and why have you put all this energy into a bank if you've never been robbed, for example? The whole idea is to secure it and protect it. Whether or not it's worth doing it for the sake of Bitcoin, I think, is another question. And I think there'll be some development over the years, and hopefully we see some greener inventions around the technology.
Thank you. An anonymous question, but I suspect it's only because of the way this person logged in. A big weakness appears to be the need to safely secure a 24-character wallet key. Is any work being done to try to make this easier for the average person?
Well, so I haven't seen it applied to blockchain, but there are some algorithms that seek to build keys based on biometric features, so you can generate them from a fingerprint. Also, a lot of these are word-based, so they use oh, it slipped my mind at the minute. They use predeterministic keys, where essentially you have 24 words, which should be a bit easier to remember. You can also get, I don't know if I've got one with me. I don't have it with me, but you can get little keys like USB sticks that allow you to put in a pin and encrypt those keys, and have various barriers. So they may have biometrics on them, for example, to make it easier. And we've seen mobile devices as well that do the same. So just like you've got, public-private key pairs on your phone that aren't secured by you remembering the key, but by your fingerprint or pin, there's that option as well.
Super, thanks. Another anonymous question. Could you explain how smart contracts would work? For example, buying a house subject to a mortgage, which would give the lender a charge over the property. So I guess this is a sort of hello world type illustration of smart contracts.
Yeah. So smart contracts are really a sequence of transactions. So you could add, and the beauty of them is that you can bring everyone involved. So if you take buying a house, for example, you've got the vendor, you've got the buyer, you've also got the estate agent, attorneys, you've got surveyors. So all these people are essentially involved in a pipeline, as well as the mortgage broker and mortgage provider. So all these people can interact with a particular address on a blockchain network with a different transaction, such as you may have the buyer, for example, could put in a request to offer. That would then be accepted by the vendor. Then maybe the buyer would tag in an address belonging to their mortgage lender, and essentially give people visibility of what happened by involving them with these transactions. And the key thing is you can have these transactions dependent on one another. So if a certain stage doesn't happen that should happen, it becomes very apparent very quickly who's not done that. So for example, if the vendor hasn't relinquished ownership of the asset, for example, then the mortgage lender could prevent transfer of funds, and you could have that happen simultaneously. Whereas at the minute, what you have is all the money going to a solicitor and lots of mess as everyone tries to sort that out. And the idea is you have these parties interacting simultaneously and agreeing on things at the same time. I think it's very hard to give a good example without sort of a whiteboard in front of me, but I hope that gives you some insight there.
Oh, that's great, thanks. Right, question from Lloyd. what is the biggest barrier to the widespread adoption of blockchain? And I'd encourage you, Jonathan, to question the assumption in this question if you wish.
Um, so, I mean, I think it's partly it's history. I mean, I think historically, blockchain has meant Bitcoin, and Bitcoin has meant sale of drugs on the dark net. I think that's a big problem. I think it's partly a lack of understanding. People see it as technology that often doesn't solve anything. So there's lots of companies out there offering to do X, Y, and Z on a blockchain, but there's no real advantage. And I think because there's a lot of noise at the minute, I think the true use cases are being neglected. And I think it's very important that we look for opportunities where you have things like multiple people coming together in a trustless way, where you have particularly digital assets. I'm much more passionate about blockchain projects that involve digital assets over physical assets. I think there are barriers to tracking physical assets. But also I think it's getting past that hype and allowing people to sort of see the potential, because at the minute there's a lot of noise.
Okay. Got a question about rural blockchain from Rajan. It's really what to do if you've got problems with internet connectivity.
So this is kind of cool, because blockchain transactions don't need connectivity. You may be taking some risk by doing transactions offline, but you can do work offline. So one of the things we've been looking at is IoT devices that may have transient connectivity, allowing them to do a whole load of work. And they may have connectivity to nearby devices, but not connectivity to a wider network. So allowing them sort of a pocket blockchain where they're agreeing transactions, everything's confirmed and everything's countersigned. And then when connectivity becomes available, broadcasting that, because the transactions themselves are really just cryptographic signatures. They're basically just maths and a record of that maths. So you can do stuff offline. I think one of the big challenges, though, if you're trying to maintain a whole record of the blockchain, that can be difficult. If you're relying on things like frequent financial transactions, you end up with that challenge that I mentioned with routing attacks, where people can give you a false perspective of the network. But there are ways, there are even sort of advantages to using blockchains in those scenarios where you want to share some information over time. I guess it depends on the particular application for blockchain that you have. I think if it's as a cryptocurrency for financial transactions, it's probably not going to work rurally. But if it's other things such as sharing data, I think that's much easier and something that blockchain supports quite well.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. I propose to take one more question as the final one, and then hand over to Mike to wrap up. I know Mike's had connectivity problems, so fingers crossed everything will work. So final question, once again anonymous, but I imagine from one of many people who signed in that way. If we have access to millions of nodes covering the UK to provide peer-to-peer hyperconnectivity as an alternate infrastructure to internet, would this increase UK security? Would you like me to read that again, Jonathan? I think in my mind, it's sort of saying what would happen if we tried to just connect everything to everything. And
yeah, I mean, I like it. So I'm an amateur radio enthusiast, so I've done a little bit of sort of peer-to-peer networking over the radio. I think it's a cool idea. I think there's a reason why it hasn't been done yet is it's very difficult to get that balance. I think that we're seeing more and more of those sorts of mesh networks emerging, though, particularly as we have sort of LoRa more and more available. And I think it has been used with blockchain to various extents. I think you always have an issue there, though, where the advantage of the internet is almost everyone has access to it. When you have localized networks like that with blockchain, you are at risk of causing segmentation of the network and essentially being at risk of having the wrong perspective of the network, maybe having information that's out of date or being fooled into things that haven't happened. So I think it's risky, but it's a nice idea.
That's great. Thanks ever so much, Jonathan. Can I hand over to Mike now to wrap up for tonight?
Yeah. Hello, Alan. Yes. Last. I'm coming in. Yes, but in closing this meeting, I would like to thank Jonathan Roscoe, our speaker, who's given an excellent talk, well presented, lots of information, and presentation is on screen. I'm sure this will be a lot of interesting to many people, and no doubt some food for thought. By the way, the talk has been recorded and will be available for viewing stroke downloading. But at the moment, I can't answer the questions to just how you would go about that. But it will be available probably for some days after. And you can probably get that some information about that on the IET website. If you can put in a question about that. Thank you very much for giving a talk, and thanks very much to our attenders who about 190 something of them left still on, I think, but it was much more to start with. 253, I think I noticed. So altogether, I think it's been a very successful event. So I think with that, we may as well close it down, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.